The Sherman family moved to northeastern Utah in the spring of 1994. Terry and Gwen Sherman had been ranching for years. They knew what a working property looked like and what they needed from one. When they found a 512-acre parcel in the Uinta Basin, good pasture, outbuildings, a farmhouse that needed work but had good bones, they made an offer. The price was below what comparable land in the area was selling for. They did not ask why. They moved in on a Thursday. By Saturday evening, Terry had encountered something he could not explain. He was walking the property perimeter at dusk when he noticed a large animal near the northwest tree line. Large is the word he used consistently in every subsequent account. Not simply big, but large in a way that registered before he had processed what he was seeing. He estimated it at several hundred pounds. It was not a bear. It walked toward him without aggression, without the body language he would have recognized from any animal he knew. He fired 3 times with his rifle at close range. The animal did not react. It turned and walked back toward the tree line and disappeared. He found no blood, no tracks, no physical evidence that anything had been there at all. He went inside and told his family what had happened. It was their second night on the property. Over the next 2 years, that encounter would come to seem almost ordinary. Before describing what happened at the ranch, it is worth establishing what kind of people the Shermans were, because their character is part of the evidentiary record. They were not paranormal enthusiasts. They had no history of reporting unusual experiences. Terry Sherman was a rancher and a horseman, a practical man with practical concerns. Gwen Sherman was equally grounded. Their children were ordinary children. They did not want to have the experiences they had. They did not profit from them in any significant way. By the time their story became public, they had already left the property and wanted nothing more than to put the experience behind them. They have been interviewed repeatedly over the years, and their accounts have remained consistent in the specific details that consistency matters for. George Knapp, the Las Vegas journalist who broke the story and who has known the Shermans personally for decades, has described them as among the most reluctant witnesses he has ever interviewed. People who were deeply uncomfortable with public attention and who spoke about their experiences because they felt an obligation to accuracy, not because they sought the spotlight. This matters. The credibility of the Skinwalker Ranch documentation rests significantly on the credibility of the primary witnesses. The Shermans hold up well under that scrutiny. The events of the Sherman tenancy at what became known as Skinwalker Ranch are documented in detail in Hunt for the Skinwalker, the 2005 book by Knapp and Colm Kelleher. The book is careful. It makes no claims beyond what the documented record supports. What that record contains is, by any fair assessment, genuinely extraordinary. The cattle mutilations began within weeks of the family's arrival. The pattern was consistent with what investigators call the classic mutilation profile, documented across the American West since the 1960s. Animals found dead with surgical precision incisions removing specific organs. No blood at the scene despite the nature of the injuries. No tracks of predator or scavenger approaching or leaving the carcass. Incisions that, when examined by veterinary pathologists, showed characteristics inconsistent with any known tool or any known predator. The Shermans lost multiple animals to this over their 2 years on the property. Each incident was reported to local law enforcement. Each investigation produced no conventional explanation. To be clear about what this means, not that the investigations were cursory or incompetent. Experienced investigators, including people with veterinary training, examined the carcasses and could not account for what they found. The absence of explanation is the documented finding, not an assumption. The poltergeist phenomena at the ranch are harder to document than the physical cattle evidence, for the obvious reason that objects moving and sounds occurring without apparent cause are difficult to capture instrumentally and easy to dismiss as misperception. What makes the Sherman accounts different from standard poltergeist reports is that the events were witnessed by multiple people simultaneously on multiple occasions, including outside investigators who arrived specifically to study them. Objects moved in the farmhouse in ways the family could not account for. Equipment was found in configurations that required deliberate placement. The family described waking to find the physical environment of the house altered overnight. None of this was dramatic in the cinematic sense. It was unsettling precisely because it was mundane. Furniture moved, tools relocated, the ordinary objects of daily life rearranged by something that was present when nothing should have been present. The Shermans were not the kind of people who embellished. Their accounts of these events were matter-of-fact in a way that Knapp found more convincing than dramatic testimony would have been. They described what happened. They did not perform distress about it. They reported it because it was occurring and because they were trying to understand it. The aerial phenomena at the property, the structured lights and objects observed at night over the ranch are the category of event most consistent with the broader UAP literature and therefore the most straightforward to contextualize. Unusual lights over the Uinta Basin are not a phenomenon that began with the Shermans. The region has one of the highest concentrations of reported UAP activity in the American West, with accounts extending back through the historical record into the oral traditions of the Ute people who have inhabited the basin for centuries. What the Shermans reported was consistent with this broader pattern. Structured objects at night, exhibiting movement inconsistent with known aircraft. In several instances, objects that appeared to descend toward specific areas of the property and then depart. On one occasion, an object that witnesses described as appearing to emerge from an opening in the sky, a circular aperture that appeared, through which the object exited and then closed. Multiple witnesses in the Shermans and in the NIDS team that subsequently investigated the property described versions of this aperture phenomenon. The descriptions are consistent with each other across independent accounts. This is the evidence as it stands, not proof of any specific explanation. A consistent multiply-witnessed observation that does not correspond to any known natural or technological phenomenon. The most significant single incident of the Sherman tenancy involves the family's dogs, and it is significant not for what was seen, but for what was found afterward. Terry Sherman and his son were working near the pasture when they noticed something large in a tree at the property boundary. A figure of substantial size, apparently sitting in the branches and watching them. Their description of it was not specific enough to identify it as any known species. Its size was inconsistent with any animal that lives in trees in that region. Their 3 dogs, experienced working animals accustomed to the property and to wildlife, charged toward it when it descended and moved toward the brush. The dogs did not come back. The next morning, in the area where the figure had entered the brush, they found circular areas of scorched and altered vegetation. The circles were specific in their geometry, not the chaotic pattern of a fire that spreads, but contained, bounded, precise. 3 of them in a specific arrangement. No remains of the dogs were found, not then and not subsequently. This is the detail that has stayed with the people who have investigated the ranch most closely, not the dramatic aerial phenomena, not the creature sightings. 3 working dogs, experienced animals without a history of running off, that followed something into a brush line and were never seen again. No conventional explanation accounts for it. The National Institute for Discovery Science, funded by Las Vegas real estate developer Robert Bigelow, purchased the property from the Shermans in 1996 and began what became a multi-year scientific investigation. Bigelow's decision to purchase the property was straightforward. He believed the ranch represented the most active, most sustained, most documented multi-phenomena location in North America, and he had the resources to study it seriously. The team he assembled for NIDS was not a paranormal investigation team in the popular sense. It included PhD-level scientists in biology, chemistry, and physics, former law enforcement and military intelligence personnel, veterinary specialists, materials scientists, people whose professional training was in evidence collection and rigorous analysis. They came with significant monitoring equipment, multiple overlapping camera systems, motion sensors, electromagnetic field monitoring, geophysical instruments. The property was instrumented at a level that no comparable location had previously received, and they found things. Not a definitive specimen, not a captured device, not a mechanism that resolved what was occurring, but physical evidence, tissue samples with anomalous characteristics, electromagnetic signatures without conventional explanations, physical traces in soil and vegetation consistent with intense, localized energy events. This evidence was collected under controlled conditions with maintained chain of custody. It was examined by external specialists. It is documented in the NIDS records and in the Kelleher and Knapp book. It has not been adequately explained by any conventional framework. The finding that Kelleher has described as most significant, the finding that, in his account, most changed his understanding of what the investigation was dealing with, was not any specific physical evidence. It was the pattern of how the phenomena related to the investigation itself. Over the years of NIDS fieldwork, a consistent dynamic emerged. When new monitoring equipment was deployed, event frequency in the monitored categories decreased. When monitoring coverage had gaps, equipment down for maintenance, team attention directed elsewhere, events occurred in those gaps. The phenomena appeared to track the investigation's capabilities and adjust accordingly. This is not a finding that conventional scientific methodology is equipped to process. Science is built on the assumption of a passive subject, a phenomenon that behaves the same whether or not it is being studied. The NIDS investigation documented what appeared to be an active subject, something that was aware of being investigated and was managing its own relationship to the investigation. Kelleher described this carefully in interviews, in the specific language of someone trained in rigorous evidence evaluation who arrived at a conclusion his training did not prepare him for. He did not claim certainty. He described what the pattern suggested and acknowledged the specific challenge it posed to conventional methodology. Whatever was at Skinwalker Ranch appeared to know it was being studied and appeared to decide consistently what to show. The Ute community of the surrounding area had tried to tell the Sherman family about the property before they moved in. This is documented. Several Ute community members made contact with the Shermans before or shortly after their arrival and attempted to convey that the land had a history the real estate transaction had not communicated. The specific content of those conversations, as the Shermans later described them, was that the area had a long-standing significance in Ute tradition, that specific behaviors were advisable when on the land, that certain locations on the property warranted particular care. The Shermans heard this. They were practical people from a practical background, and the framework that would have allowed them to receive this information as the empirical guidance it was, accumulated from generations of direct experience with the specific landscape, was not part of their experience. They were polite. They were not dismissive. They simply did not have a way to act on what they were being told. What the Ute tradition knows about the Uinta Basin is not identical to what the NIDS investigation documented. The frameworks are different, the vocabulary is different, the purposes are different, but the territory they are describing overlaps significantly. The specific geographic area, the specific characteristics of that area, the need for specific behaviors when entering it. The tradition encoded this knowledge over centuries of direct experience. The investigation documented it over years of instrumental observation. Both arrived at the same basic conclusion. Something is there. It has been there for a long time, and it requires a different kind of engagement than ordinary terrain. The difference between them is that the tradition developed that knowledge slowly enough to also develop the appropriate protocols. The investigation arrived at the knowledge without the time to develop what comes next. The Shermans sold the property in 1996. They left because 2 years of accumulated events without explanation, without resolution, without any institutional framework to help them understand what was happening on their land, had become more than the practical management of a working ranch could absorb. They have said in various interviews over the years that they do not regret leaving, that they would not go back, that the experience changed them in ways they did not ask to be changed and have not entirely processed. Terry Sherman's account of the experience is not dramatic. It is the account of a man who encountered something that his entire framework for understanding the world could not accommodate, and who has lived with that incompatibility for 30 years. He does not claim to know what was there. He claims to know that something was there, that it was beyond anything he had encountered in decades of outdoor life, and that the rifle he reached for on the second night was not the right tool for whatever the situation required. He is right about that last part. Whatever was at the ranch in 1994 has not been explained in the 30 years since. Not by the NIDS investigation, not by the subsequent investigators who have worked the property under different ownership, not by the classified government programs that, according to multiple former officials, were also paying attention to what was occurring in the Uinta Basin during this period. The ranch is still there. The valley is still there. The Ute tradition that has always known the area as a place requiring specific care is still there, and whatever the Sherman family encountered, whatever walked out of the dark toward Terry on the second night, whatever killed his dogs without leaving a trace, whatever the NIDS instruments detected and could not explain, is, by all available evidence, still there too. Not as a dramatic presence announcing itself, as what it has always been, something in the landscape of the Uinta Basin that exists in a different relationship to the physical world than the ordinary contents of a working ranch, something the Ute tradition has protocols for, that the Sherman family did not have, before the second night, when it would have mattered most. There is a detail about the property's purchase history that researchers have noted, but that has not been fully examined. The Shermans paid below market value for a 512-acre property with good pasture and outbuildings in a region where comparable land was selling for more. Real estate transactions at below market prices have explanations. Structural problems with the property, legal encumbrances, a motivated seller needing quick liquidity. In this case, the explanation that subsequent investigation suggested was simpler. The property had a local reputation. People in the Uinta Basin knew the land had a history, not in a dramatic or publicized way, in the quiet, practical way that rural communities accumulate knowledge about specific places. You heard about it from someone who heard about it. You knew not to ask too many questions about that particular parcel, and if you were selling it, you priced it to move. The Shermans were from outside the area. They did not have access to the local knowledge. The transaction was legal and straightforward. They got a good price on a working property. They also got everything that came with it. This is not an unusual pattern in the history of high strangeness locations. The Skinwalker Ranch case is notable partly because it is well documented, but the basic structure, property with anomalous history, changes hands to buyers without local knowledge. Buyers encounter what the local community already knew, appears in accounts from other locations. The local knowledge exists before the outside investigation. It is informal, oral, and not incorporated into any official record. The outside investigator arrives, documents what the locals already knew, and treats it as a discovery. The Ute community's attempt to brief the Shermans fits this pattern. The knowledge existed. The transmission failed, not because the knowledge was not offered, but because the framework to receive it was not present in the recipients. The specific geographic characteristics of the Skinwalker Ranch property are relevant to understanding why this location, rather than others in the broader Uinta Basin, became the focal point of documented activity. The ranch sits in a section of the basin where several terrain features converge. The Duchenne River drainage passes within a few miles. The specific section of the basin where the property sits has a geological substrate that researchers have noted as unusual, even within the already unusual geology of the broader basin. The electromagnetic field characteristics of the immediate area show anomalies that the surrounding terrain does not show to the same degree. This is documented in geophysical surveys. The specific surveys, their findings, and who commissioned them are not all in the public record. Some of the relevant geological work in the basin has been conducted by government agencies whose survey reports are not fully declassified, but the basic geophysical distinctiveness of the area is documentable from publicly available data. The NIDS team noted the electromagnetic characteristics of the property in their monitoring work. The specific frequency signatures and field strength anomalies recorded at the ranch are documented in their reports. Whether the geophysical characteristics of the location are causally related to the anomalous activity documented there, whether the specific geology and hydrology create conditions that enable or facilitate whatever was occurring, is not established. The correlation is real. The mechanism, if any exists, is not understood. What is established is that the specific 512 acres the Shermans purchased sat within a section of an already unusual basin that had additional unusual characteristics of its own. The Ute protocols around the broader basin are more specific still around this section. The documented activity was concentrated here rather than evenly distributed across the basin. These are not coincidences that demand a specific explanation. They are patterns worth noting honestly without forcing a conclusion. The stack. George Knapp's term for the co-occurrence of multiple categories of anomalous phenomena at a single location is the conceptual contribution that the Skinwalker Ranch investigation made to the broader field that has had the most lasting impact. Before the NIDS investigation and the public documentation it produced, the standard approach to anomalous phenomena was categorical. UFO researchers studied UAPs. Cryptid researchers studied unknown creatures. Parapsychologists studied poltergeist phenomena. Each community had its own methodology, its own evidence standards, its own theoretical frameworks. What the Skinwalker Ranch record showed was that these categories, however useful for organizing research communities, did not map cleanly onto what actually occurred at a high strangeness location. The cattle mutilations and the aerial phenomena and the creature encounters and the poltergeist activity were not separate events that happened to occur on the same property. They were co-occurring features of a single location, appearing over the same extended period, observed by the same witnesses. The stack forced a question that the categorical research communities had not been asking. What do these phenomena have in common? What shared property of the location, or of whatever was at the location, produced all of them? Knapp has described this as the most important insight to come out of the ranch investigation, not any specific finding. The frame that the findings demanded. The phenomena are not separate. They are a stack. And the stack points toward a common source that none of the individual categorical frameworks is equipped to explain. Whether that common source is a single type of non-human intelligence, a geophysical condition that enables multiple types of anomalous phenomena, or something else that has not yet been adequately articulated, the stack does not answer that question. It poses it, and it has not been adequately answered in the decades since. Robert Bigelow's role in the Skinwalker Ranch story is worth understanding clearly, because he is sometimes portrayed in ways that distort his actual position. He was a businessman with a genuine and long-standing interest in anomalous phenomena. He had money. He had the judgment to recognize that the ranch represented an unusual research opportunity. He funded the NIDS investigation at a level that no comparable civilian research had previously received. He was not a scientist. He was not a researcher in the technical sense. He was a funder and a facilitator who assembled a credentialed team and gave them resources to work with. His subsequent relationship with government programs, the contracts that connected his Bigelow Aerospace Company to ATIP after the NIDS investigation concluded, are documented in general terms by the post-2017 disclosure record. The specific nature of those contracts and what knowledge was exchanged is not fully in the public record. What Bigelow said publicly in a 2017 interview is worth noting for its directness. Asked whether he believed intelligent non-human entities existed, he said yes without hesitation. Asked whether they were near, he said they were right under our noses. He said this on national television in a serious interview context, without the qualifications and hedges that most people in similar positions deploy. Whether his confidence was warranted by what he knew from the ranch investigation, from the government program connections, or from both, is not something the public record allows to determine. His statement was direct. It has not been retracted. The cattle mutilation phenomenon that occurred repeatedly at the ranch is worth addressing specifically because it is sometimes treated as the most explainable element of the stack. The conventional explanation is predation and scavenging. that the surgical appearance of the wounds reflects the specific feeding patterns of ravens, coyotes, and other scavengers, and that the absence of blood reflects decomposition and drainage. This explanation has been examined by multiple veterinary pathologists over decades of mutilation cases. The consistent finding of those examinations is that the conventional explanation does not account for the specific characteristics of the wounds in the most anomalous cases. The incision edges in the classic mutilation cases show characteristics that surgical cutting produces and that predator feeding does not. The specific selection of organs, consistent across cases from different states, different decades, different species of cattle, is not consistent with opportunistic scavenging patterns. The absence of tracks and blood at scenes is not explained by natural decomposition in the time frames involved. At the Sherman Ranch, the cases that the NIDS team examined produced tissue samples that pathologists described as showing cellular characteristics at wound margins inconsistent with any known cutting mechanism, not simply unusual, inconsistent with the known range of what conventional tools produce at the cellular level. This is documented in the NIDS records. It is a specific finding from specific tissue analysis by qualified pathologists. It has not been explained. The conventional explanation does not account for it. The existence of an unconventional explanation that does account for it has not been established. What is established is that something made those incisions with a precision and through a mechanism that the available evidence cannot identify. The account that has stayed with George Knapp most clearly, the account he has returned to across years of public discussion of the ranch investigation, involves not a dramatic event, but a quiet one. Terry Sherman, late in the family's tenancy, standing alone in the pasture in the evening, not doing anything specific, just standing as farmers sometimes stand at the end of a day, present with their land, and becoming aware, gradually, that something was also present, not visible, not audible, present in the specific way that presence is felt before any conventional sense confirms it. The quality of awareness that multiple witnesses in multiple different contexts across this series have described, the sense that the landscape's attention is directed toward you. He stood there. The presence stood there for what he described as a long time, and then it was gone. No sound, no movement he could detect, simply no longer present in the way it had been. He went inside. He did not tell anyone about it for a long time. When he eventually described it to Knapp, his framing was not dramatic. He said, "We were just in the same field. Whatever it was, and whatever I am, we were both in the same field for a while." Knapp has said this account affected him more than any of the dramatic events documented at the ranch, because it described something that the documentation of events and the collection of evidence cannot capture: the specific quality of being in the presence of something that is aware of you, without threat, without communication in any conventional sense, simply present in the same space with a different kind of relationship to that space than you have. That quality is documented in various forms across this entire series, in the encounter accounts, in the research reports, in the traditional knowledge frameworks that developed around sustained experience with specific places and what they hold. Terry Sherman experienced it directly, in a pasture in northeastern Utah, at the end of a day, before the family left the property for the last time. The investigation of Skinwalker Ranch has continued under subsequent ownership. The History Channel documentary series, The Ongoing Research Activity at the Property, The continuing involvement of people connected to the original NIDS investigation all have produced additional documentation. The phenomena have continued under different ownership, with different investigators, with different monitoring technology. The stack has persisted. New events in the same categories, the same geographic concentration, the same apparent awareness of observation. This persistence is significant. Whatever was documented during the Sherman tenancy and the NIDS investigation is not a historical artifact of a specific period. It is ongoing. The location continues to produce what it has been producing for as long as anyone has been keeping records, and, according to Ute oral tradition, for considerably longer than the written record extends. This is the straightforward summary of what the Skinwalker Ranch evidence shows. The phenomena are real and have been consistently documented by credible observers over an extended period. The physical evidence is genuine and has not been conventionally explained. The location has specific geophysical characteristics that correlate with the documented activity. The traditional knowledge of the community, with the longest relationship to the area, identifies the location as significant and describes behaviors appropriate to that significance. The investigation produced real findings and real questions that remain open. No single explanation accounts for everything. The evidence is substantial enough to warrant serious investigation. The serious investigation that has occurred has produced documentation without resolution. That is where the record stands. Honestly and without inflation. In a valley in northeastern Utah, where something has been occurring for longer than anyone has been studying it, and will continue occurring, whatever it is, whatever it means. In the specific place where the Sherman family moved in the spring of 1994, and found what has always been there before they arrived and after they left. There are aspects of the Skinwalker Ranch story that the popular coverage tends to either overstate or understate, and both distortions are worth correcting. The overstated version treats the ranch as proof of extraterrestrial presence, interdimensional portals, and ancient non-human intelligence managing human access to secret knowledge. This version is more dramatic than the evidence supports. The documented findings are genuinely anomalous. They are not proof of any specific explanation. The understated version dismisses the entire record as hoax, mass suggestion, or the product of credulous people in a credulous cultural moment. This version requires ignoring the physical evidence, the credentials of the investigators, the consistency of independent witness accounts, and the traditional knowledge of the Ute community. It is not a position that engages honestly with what was actually documented. The honest version is more difficult to hold because it requires sitting with genuine uncertainty. Something was occurring at the ranch. The physical evidence is real. The witnesses are credible. The phenomena are not explained by any conventional framework. What they are, what mechanism produces them, what their ultimate nature is not established by the available evidence. This is not a comfortable position. It does not give the audience a resolution, but it is what the evidence actually shows, and treating the evidence honestly requires saying so. The Skinwalker Ranch record is one of the most extensively documented anomalous locations in the world. That documentation establishes that something real and unexplained was occurring there over an extended period, with physical evidence that qualified investigators could not conventionally explain. It does not establish what that something is. The investigation that would establish it has not been completed. It may not be completable with currently available tools and frameworks. That is the honest summary of where the Skinwalker Ranch evidence stands. The broader context of the Uinta Basin matters for understanding what the ranch represents. The basin has one of the highest concentrations of reported anomalous activity in the American West. UAP reports in the region predate the Sherman tendency by decades and extend back into historical settler accounts from the 19th century. The Ute tradition's identification of the basin as a location requiring specific protocols predates European contact entirely. What occurred on the Sherman property was not isolated. It was one expression of a broader pattern of unusual activity concentrated in that geographic area. The ranch was not special because unusual things happened there that did not happen elsewhere in the basin. It was special because the unusual things that happened there happened with unusual frequency and intensity, and because the NIDS investigation provided resources and methodology for documentation that other locations in the basin have not received. The ranch is the most visible point on a broader pattern. Understanding it requires understanding the pattern, not just the point. The pattern includes the geophysical characteristics of the basin, the unusual geology, the electromagnetic anomalies, the water system. It includes the traditional knowledge of the people who have lived there longest. It includes the broader distribution of anomalous activity across the basin that the ranch's fame has partially obscured. The investigation of Skinwalker Ranch produced valuable documentation. The investigation of the Uinta Basin as a whole has not been done. That broader investigation is what the ranch evidence, taken seriously, points toward. The NIDS team's finding about the apparent awareness of the phenomena, the observer effect documented across years of fieldwork, deserves careful framing. It is a real finding in the sense that the pattern of event distribution relative to monitoring coverage was genuine and is documented. The phenomena did appear consistently to occur in gaps in the monitoring apparatus. There are multiple possible explanations for this pattern. One is that the phenomena are genuinely responsive to observation, that whatever was occurring at the ranch was aware of the monitoring equipment and managed its activity accordingly. This is the most dramatic interpretation and the one that implies the highest level of intelligence and agency in whatever was producing the phenomena. Another is that the monitoring apparatus itself, or the presence of the investigators, physically altered the conditions required for the phenomena to occur. If the phenomena depend on specific electromagnetic conditions, for example, the introduction of monitoring equipment generating its own electromagnetic fields might suppress them. This would produce the same pattern without requiring awareness or agency. A third is that the pattern is partially an artifact of how events were identified and reported. Events that occurred when investigators were present and attentive were documented more thoroughly than events during coverage gaps, potentially inflating the apparent concentration in gaps. Kelleher acknowledged the first possibility as the most consistent with the overall pattern. He did not claim it as the only possible explanation. He noted it honestly as what the evidence suggested, while acknowledging the methodological limitations of the finding. That honest framing is worth maintaining. The observer effect is documented as a pattern. What produces the pattern is not established. The most striking interpretation that the phenomena are genuinely aware and responsive is consistent with the evidence but is not proven by it. Before this episode closes, it is worth addressing the question that the Skinwalker Ranch record, taken seriously, most directly raises. If something genuinely anomalous was occurring at that property, if the physical evidence is real, the witnesses are credible, and the phenomena are not explained by conventional frameworks, what does that mean for how we understand the world? This is not a question that evidence can answer. Evidence tells us what happened. It does not tell us what it means in the larger sense. What the evidence establishes is a boundary, a point where the frameworks we use to explain physical reality become inadequate, where the phenomena documented cannot be accounted for by the tools and categories currently available. Boundaries of this kind are not new in the history of science. There were boundaries before the germ theory of disease was established, cases of illness that existing frameworks could not explain. Boundaries before plate tectonics, geological observations that did not fit the available models. The existence of a boundary does not tell us what lies beyond it, but it tells us that something does. The Skinwalker Ranch evidence marks a boundary. Something was occurring there that existing frameworks cannot explain. What lies beyond that boundary, what the explanation would look like if it existed, is genuinely unknown. The traditions of the people who have lived alongside the basin longest have their own framework for what lies beyond it. That framework developed from centuries of direct experience and is worth taking seriously as accumulated empirical knowledge, even if it cannot be directly translated into the terms of Western science. The scientific investigation produced documentation of the boundary without crossing it. Both the traditional knowledge and the scientific investigation are pointing at the same place. Neither has fully described what is there. That is where the investigation stands. Honestly, without the inflation that the dramatic nature of the subject makes tempting, and without the dismissal that institutional discomfort makes easy. In the Uinta Basin, where something has been occurring for a very long time that the available frameworks have not yet explained, and that continues to occur, whatever the explanation eventually turns out to be. There is one practical observation worth including before this episode ends. The Skinwalker Ranch story has become a media property. The History Channel series, the ongoing coverage, the social media presence. All of this has layered commercial production values over what began as a specific, documented set of events experienced by a real family and investigated by a real scientific team. That commercialization is worth acknowledging because it affects how the underlying evidence is perceived. The original documentation, the Sherman family accounts, the NIDS investigation records, the Kelleher and Knapp book, is careful and grounded. It makes claims proportional to what the evidence supports. It acknowledges uncertainty. It distinguishes between what was observed and what it might mean. Much of the subsequent coverage does not maintain these standards. Events are presented with more certainty than the evidence warrants. Connections are drawn more confidently than the data supports. The dramatic frame expands to fill the available airtime. For anyone engaging with this subject seriously, the original documentation is more valuable than the subsequent coverage. The NIDS findings, the Sherman family accounts as recorded by Knapp, the specific physical evidence analysis, these are the record. The television series is a production built around the record. The distinction matters because the standards of evidence are different. The record is worth taking seriously. The production around it is worth watching with appropriate skepticism. That applies to this series as well. The documentary format creates atmospheric pressure toward certainty, and toward connections that the evidence does not always fully support. The goal has been to resist that pressure, to maintain the tone while staying honest about what the documented evidence actually establishes. The Skinwalker Ranch evidence, taken on its own terms, establishes that something real and genuinely unexplained was occurring at a specific property in northeastern Utah over a specific period. That is significant. It does not require embellishment to be significant. It stands on its own, as the Sherman family's experience stands on its own. 2 years on a property that had been producing anomalous events since long before they arrived, that continues producing them now. In the Uinta Basin, where the Ute tradition knew what was there before anyone else thought to ask. There is a final note on the sources used in this episode. The primary sources are the Sherman family accounts as documented by George Knapp over years of interviews. Hunt for the Skinwalker by Colum Kelleher and George Knapp, published 2005, the publicly available portions of the NIDS investigation documentation, and the public record of Robert Bigelow's statements about the property and the investigation. What is not sourced to documents? The specific content of the Ute community's conversations with the Shermans, which is reported secondhand through the Shermans' recollections. The specific details of what classified government programs may have found in the basin, which remain in the classified record. The precise mechanisms behind any of the documented phenomena, which have not been established by any published research. The episode distinguishes between what the documented record shows and what it suggests. Where the boundary between those two things is unclear, the honest answer is to say so, rather than to smooth it over with confident language. The Sherman family's experience at Skinwalker Ranch is documented. It is real. It is not fully explained. Those three things together are significant enough to take seriously. They do not need to be more than they are. The valley in northeastern Utah is still there. The Duchesne River still runs through it. The Ute reservation land is still adjacent. The property that the Sherman family purchased in 1994 still exists, still attracts investigators, still produces documentation that raises questions the documentation cannot answer. Whatever occurred there during the 2 years the Shermans lived on it, whatever the NIDS team spent years trying to characterize, is real in the specific sense that real events leave real evidence, and the evidence here has been examined by qualified people who found it genuinely anomalous. That is what the record shows, not proof of extraterrestrials, not confirmation of interdimensional portals, not the definitive revelation of what shares this world with us. Evidence that something was occurring at a specific location that the available frameworks cannot explain. Evidence that is substantial enough to warrant serious investigation. Evidence that has received serious investigation and that investigation produced more questions than answers. That is an honest summary of the Skinwalker Ranch record. It is also, in its own way, significant, because the history of human knowledge is largely the history of encountering things that existing frameworks can't explain, and developing new frameworks to explain them. The Skinwalker Ranch evidence may be pointing toward a framework that does not yet exist, or it may eventually yield to a conventional explanation that better evidence will reveal. The honest investigator holds both possibilities open and keeps looking with the patience that genuine questions deserve. The Sherman family's experience at Skinwalker Ranch deserves one final acknowledgement. They were ordinary people who moved to a property and found that the property had characteristics they were not prepared for. They reported what happened honestly. They submitted to years of investigation and interviews with patience and consistency. They eventually walked away from the property and, as much as possible, from the public attention that followed. Whatever the ultimate explanation for what they experienced, they did not ask for the experience. They did not benefit from it in ways that would give them reason to fabricate or embellish. Their accounts have held up under decades of scrutiny. The respect owed to genuine witnesses, to people who report what they experienced honestly, without agenda, at personal cost, is part of what taking this subject seriously means. The Sherman family earned that respect. Their account is part of the record, and the record taken honestly points toward something that the available explanations have not yet accounted for. In northeastern Utah, in the valley where they lived for 2 years, and where the investigation continues, in search of the explanation that the evidence has always deserved. The investigation at Skinwalker Ranch, whatever its ultimate meaning, established something useful for anyone studying anomalous phenomena seriously. It established that the phenomena resist the standard investigative approach. Not because they are not real, the physical evidence is real, but because they appear to behave differently when the investigative apparatus is present. This is a finding, not a failure. It tells us something specific about the nature of what is being studied. Whatever produces the Skinwalker Ranch phenomena is not a passive subject that behaves consistently regardless of observation context. The pattern of event distribution relative to monitoring coverage, documented carefully by the NIDS team, points towards something that has a relationship to observation itself. Whether that relationship reflects genuine awareness and agency, or a physical dependency on specific conditions that the monitoring apparatus disrupts, or something else not yet articulated, the investigation cannot determine from the data collected. What it can say is that conventional scientific methodology designed for passive subjects in reproducible experimental conditions is not the right tool for this specific investigation. The subject does not cooperate with the methodology. That is information. It suggests that whatever framework will eventually explain the Skinwalker Ranch phenomena will need to account for a subject that is not passive. That is not a small constraint on the explanatory framework. It may be the most important constraint, and it points, perhaps more than anything else in the ranch documentation, toward how different an adequate explanation will need to be from anything currently available. The evidence is real. The explanation is not yet available. The investigation continues. Honestly, without more certainty than the record supports. The Shermans left in 1996. The valley is still there. The investigation continues. The explanation is still outstanding. The Shermans left in 1996. The valley is still there. The investigation continues. The explanation is still outstanding.